Starving boy sings an old song outside the market. Upon hearing it, a woman drops her bags and begins to cry. The air outside the busy market was sharp and unforgiving, the kind of cold that crept into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. Claire Henderson tightened her scarf and balanced 2 heavy grocery bags in her hands, her thoughts on the long to-do list waiting for her at home. The sidewalk was bustling with people, parents tugging children along, delivery drivers unloading crates, and hurried shoppers weaving through the crowd. Amid the clamor, Claire's ears caught something unexpected. A voice. She froze mid-step, tilting her head as the melody drifted toward her. It was a boy's voice, young but rich with emotion, carrying a hauntingly familiar tune. Her grip on the grocery bags tightened as she followed the sound, her heart hammering in her chest. And then she saw him. The boy sat on the cold concrete, a tattered hoodie pulled tight around his thin frame. His sneakers were riddled with holes, and his face was pale with exhaustion. In front of him lay an upturned baseball cap, containing a few crumpled bills and a handful of coins. But it wasn't his appearance that struck Claire, it was his voice. The song was one she hadn't heard in years. Her brother Samuel used to sing it, his voice filling their home with light on even the darkest days. It was their mother's favorite, a tune that had carried them through countless hardships. But Samuel was gone now, and hearing it again was like being pulled into a memory she wasn't ready to relive. Claire's breath hitched, and before she realized what was happening, her grip on the grocery bag faltered. It slipped from her hand, hitting the pavement with a dull thud as apples and cans rolled onto the street. She didn't move to pick them up. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the world around her. The boy's voice faltered as he noticed her standing there, her face streaked with tears. He stopped singing and looked up at her, confused but wary. "Ma'am? Are you okay?" Claire blinked, hastily wiping her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaky. "That song, where did you learn it?" The boy shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. My grandma used to hum it a lot." "Your grandma," Claire repeated, her heart aching. The boy nodded, pulling his hoodie tighter as the wind picked up. "She said it was an old song she liked. I sing it when people want to hear something sad, it usually gets more money." He motioned to the sparse contents of his cap. "I need it for her medicine." Claire crouched down to his level, her groceries forgotten. "What's your name?" "Ryan," he said after a pause. "How old are you, Ryan?" 12. Claire's chest tightened. "Do you live nearby?" "Not really. Me and Grandma stay in a shelter most nights." His voice was matter-of-fact, but there was a quiet weight behind his words. A passerby muttered impatiently as they stepped around Claire's spilled groceries, but she barely noticed. All she could see was this boy, this child, trying to survive in a world that seemed to have given up on him. Without thinking, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. "Here," she said, pressing it into his hand. Ryan stared at the bill, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," she said firmly. "But I want to hear you sing that song again." Ryan hesitated, then gave a small nod. He placed the bill in his cap and began to sing once more. This time, Claire closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her. It was like Samuel was there with her, whispering a message she couldn't quite understand. When the song ended, she opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "Thank you, Ryan. That was beautiful." Ryan shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks for listening. Most people just walk past." Claire didn't know what she would do next, but one thing was certain, she couldn't walk away from him. The wind whipped through the narrow streets, carrying with it the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor and the chatter of hurried shoppers. Claire remained crouched by Ryan, her thoughts tangled in the melody he had sung and the memories it had stirred. She couldn't leave, not yet. "Ryan," she said softly, trying to mask the urgency in her voice. "Do you sing here every day?" He shrugged, glancing at his worn sneakers. "Not every day. Just when Grandma's not feeling good, and I need to get extra money for her meds." The casual way he said it stung Claire. A 12-year-old boy shouldn't have to shoulder such a burden. She bit her lip, torn between wanting to help and not wanting to overstep. "Does your grandma know you're out here?" Ryan hesitated before shaking his head. "She'd be mad if she knew. She thinks I'm just at school or the library, but," his voice trailed off, and he looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a quiet resilience that made him seem older than his years. Claire hesitated, unsure of how far she could push. "Where do you go after this? Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stuffed his hands into the pockets of his hoodie and looked down the street. "The shelter on 5th. It's okay, I guess. Better than the other places we've been." The shelter on 5th. Claire had driven past it before, an aging building with barred windows and peeling paint. She couldn't imagine a child living there, much less calling it home. Before she could say more, Ryan reached down to gather his few belongings, a faded backpack, his baseball cap, and the milk crate he had been sitting on. "Thanks for the 20, lady," he said, flashing her a polite smile. "But I should get going." "Wait," Claire blurted, standing up quickly. She fumbled for words, her mind racing. Can I walk with you for a bit?" Ryan gave her a suspicious look, his small frame tensing. "Why?" "I just want to make sure you're okay," she said truthfully. "You remind me of someone I used to know." His gaze softened slightly, but the wariness didn't leave his eyes. "All right," he said after a moment. "But only for a little while." They walked side by side down the bustling street, Claire's grocery bags swinging awkwardly at her sides. She wanted to ask him more, about his grandma, his life, his dreams, but she didn't want to scare him off. Instead, she said, "That song you sang earlier, it's an old one. My brother used to sing it, too." Ryan glanced at her. "Really?" She nodded, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "He had a voice like yours. Strong, but full of feeling. It was his favorite song." "What happened to him?" Ryan asked quietly. The question hit her like a punch to the gut, but she couldn't blame him for his curiosity. "He passed away," she said softly, her throat tightening. "A long time ago." Ryan didn't say anything, but his expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. They turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the market fading into the distance. Claire noticed how Ryan kept glancing over his shoulder, his posture tense. "Do you always walk this way?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "It's faster. And safer." Safer. The word lingered in her mind, a stark reminder of the life he was living. As they approached an old brick building with a faded sign reading Community Shelter, Ryan stopped. "This is it," he said, gesturing toward the door. Claire's heart sank at the sight of the shelter. It looked cold and uninviting, a far cry from the warm, stable environment a child should have. Ryan turned to her, his small smile returning. "Thanks for walking with me, Ms. Henderson," she said quickly. "Claire Henderson." "Thanks, Miss Henderson." Before she could respond, the door to the shelter creaked open, and an older woman with a worn face stepped out. She spotted Ryan and waved, her expression softening. "There you are, sweetie. I was worried." "Sorry, Grandma," Ryan called, jogging up the steps. He paused at the door and looked back at Claire. "Bye." And just like that, he was gone. Claire stood there for a long moment, her heart heavy. As much as she wanted to help, she didn't know where to start, or if Ryan would even let her. But one thing was clear, she couldn't just walk away. Claire returned home that evening, but her mind was miles away. She went through the motions, putting away groceries, preparing dinner, helping her daughters with their homework, but Ryan's voice, his face, and his story lingered in the corners of her thoughts. As she set the table, David, her husband, walked into the kitchen. "You've been quiet since you got home," he said, leaning against the counter. What's going on? Claire hesitated, running her fingers over the edge of the table. I met someone today. A boy. David raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in his expression. A boy? She nodded, trying to find the right words to explain. He was singing outside the market. He can't be more than 12, but he's out there trying to raise money for his grandmother's medicine. They're living in a shelter. David's brow furrowed. And you stopped to talk to him? I couldn't just walk past, Claire said, her voice firm. David, you should have heard him. His voice, it was incredible. And the song he sang, it was the same one Samuel used to sing. At the mention of her brother, David's expression softened. He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. I know how much Samuel's music meant to you. But you barely know this kid, Claire. You have to be careful. I know, she said quietly. But I can't stop thinking about him. He's just a child, David. Living like that, struggling like that, it's not right. David sighed, his thumb brushing against her shoulder. I get it. But you can't save everyone. You've got your own family to think about. His words stung, even though she knew he meant well. Claire nodded, forcing a smile. You're right. I feel like I need to do something. Dinner was a quiet affair that night, the usual chatter replaced by Claire's distracted silence. Even as her daughters recounted their day at school, her thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan. The sight of him sitting on that cold pavement, singing with everything he had, was etched into her mind. After the girls were in bed, Claire sat alone in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up the shelter Ryan had mentioned, reading about their programs and resources, or lack thereof. The reviews painted a grim picture: overcrowded conditions, limited staff, and insufficient funding. Her chest tightened. She could still see Ryan's hesitant smile as he disappeared through the shelter's door. She couldn't stop thinking about what he had said: I sing when Grandma's not feeling good, and I need to get extra money for her meds. Claire set her phone down and leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. She felt trapped between two worlds: the comfortable life she had built with her family and the harsh reality Ryan and his grandmother were facing. By morning, her resolve had hardened. Claire dropped her daughters off at school, kissed David goodbye as he left for work, and then headed back to the shelter. She parked across the street and watched as a steady stream of people came and went. Most of them were adults, bundled in layers against the cold, their faces etched with weariness. Finally, she saw him. Ryan stepped out of the shelter, his tattered backpack slung over one shoulder. His hood was pulled up against the wind, but his face was unmistakable. Claire got out of her car and crossed the street, calling his name. He stopped, turning toward her with a look of surprise. Ms. Henderson? What are you doing here? I wanted to see you, she said honestly. Is your grandmother all right? Ryan hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. She's okay today. Why? Claire took a deep breath. Because I want to help, Ryan. You and your grandmother shouldn't have to live like this. Ryan's expression hardened, a flicker of defensiveness in his eyes. We're fine. We don't need help. You shouldn't have to sing on the streets to afford medicine, Claire said gently. You're just a kid, Ryan. This isn't your responsibility. Yeah, well, nobody else is gonna do it, he muttered, looking away. Claire's heart broke at the bitterness in his voice. She crouched slightly, trying to meet his eyes. What if someone could? What if I could help? Would you let me? Ryan looked at her for a long moment, his guarded expression wavering. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Claire smiled faintly. Because I care. And because your voice, it reminded me of someone I loved very much. He's not here anymore, but maybe helping you would honor his memory. Ryan's lips parted slightly, his expression softening. He didn't say anything, but the tension in his shoulders eased. Can I at least buy you something to eat? Claire asked, motioning toward a nearby diner. Ryan hesitated, then gave a small nod. Okay. But just this once. As they walked toward the diner, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let Ryan face it alone. The diner was a small, unassuming place, its neon sign flickering in the gray morning light. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the smell of coffee and fried eggs. Claire and Ryan sat in a corner booth, the worn vinyl seats squeaking slightly as they settled in. Ryan scanned the menu quickly, his eyes darting over the options. "Can I get pancakes?" he asked hesitantly, glancing up at Claire as though afraid she might say no. "Of course," Claire said with a warm smile. "Get whatever you want." Ryan looked surprised but didn't argue. He added a side of bacon and orange juice, and when the waitress left with their order, he leaned back in the seat, his backpack still clutched tightly against his chest. For a moment, they sat in silence. Claire didn't want to push too hard or overwhelm him, but she knew she needed to understand his situation if she was going to help. "Ryan," she began gently, "how long have you and your grandma been staying at the shelter?" He shrugged, fiddling with the zipper of his backpack. "A few months, I guess. We had to leave our old apartment when she got sick. She couldn't work anymore, and we couldn't keep up with the rent." Claire nodded, her chest tightening. "And your parents?" "They're not around," Ryan said flatly, his gaze fixed on the table. "It's just me and her now." Claire wanted to ask more, but his tone made it clear the subject was closed. Instead, she said, "You're really brave, you know. Taking care of your grandma like that." Ryan gave a small shrug, but there was a flicker of pride in his expression. "She took care of me first. It's only fair." The waitress returned with their food, and Ryan's eyes lit up as the plate of pancakes was set in front of him. He didn't hesitate, diving in with an appetite that made Claire wonder when he had last had a proper meal. She watched him eat, her heart aching. He was just a boy who had been forced to grow up too fast. When his plate was nearly clean, Ryan leaned back in his seat, a rare smile on his face. "Thanks for this. I don't usually get to eat like this." "I'm glad you enjoyed it," Claire said. She hesitated for a moment before continuing, "Ryan, I want to do more for you. For both you and your grandma. Would you let me?" Ryan's smile faded, replaced by a wary look. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet," Claire admitted. "Maybe I could help with her medicine, or find a way to get you into a better living situation. I don't think you should have to do this alone." Ryan frowned, his fingers tightening around his fork. "People always say they want to help, but they don't. They forget about you, or they just feel sorry for you and give you stuff to make themselves feel better." His words cut deep, and Claire realized just how much hurt and disappointment he had endured. She leaned forward, her voice steady. "Ryan, I'm not going to forget about you. I'm not going to make promises I can't keep. But I will try to help, if you'll let me." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Finally, he said, "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do," Claire said firmly. Ryan exhaled, leaning back in his seat. "Okay. But don't expect me to trust you right away." "That's fair," Claire said, smiling softly. The waitress returned with the check, and Claire paid quickly, leaving a generous tip. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them like a slap. Ryan stuffed his hands into his hoodie pockets, his small frame hunched against the wind. "Do you have school today?" Claire asked as they started walking. "Yeah," Ryan said. "I go to Lincoln Middle." "It's not far." Claire nodded, filing the information away. "Can I walk you there?" Ryan hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. But you can't come inside. I don't want anyone asking questions." "Deal," Claire said. As they walked, Ryan seemed to relax slightly, his steps less guarded. Claire asked him about his favorite songs and singers, and for the first time, he talked freely, his face lighting up as he described the music that inspired him. When they reached the school, Ryan stopped at the gate and turned to her. "Thanks for breakfast," he said quietly. "Anytime," Claire said with a smile. "I'll see you soon, okay?" Ryan nodded, then slipped through the gate without another word. As Claire watched him go, she felt a deep resolve settle over her. She didn't know exactly how she was going to help Ryan and his grandmother, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't let them down. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity for Claire. She couldn't shake the image of Ryan's small figure braving the cold streets or the quiet resignation in his voice as he spoke about his struggles. She knew she needed to act, but figuring out how to help without overstepping was a delicate balance. Her first step was a phone call to the shelter where Ryan and his grandmother were staying. The director, a weary-sounding man named Tom, was reluctant to share much information at first, citing privacy concerns. "I understand," Claire said patiently, "but I'm not asking for personal details. I just want to know if there's a way to help. Is there a fund I can donate to? Something that would directly benefit Ryan and his grandmother?" Tom sighed on the other end of the line. "We don't have anything specific for individual families, but any donation to the shelter helps keep the lights on and the doors open. The truth is, we're stretched thin." "What about their medical needs?" Claire pressed. "There's a program through the community health clinic, but it's basic," Tom admitted. "For anything beyond that, they'd have to cover the costs themselves." Claire thanked him and hung up, her mind racing. She couldn't imagine the stress Ryan's grandmother must feel, knowing her grandson was sacrificing so much just to keep them afloat. It wasn't right. That afternoon, Claire picked up her daughters from school and took them to the park. As they played on the swings and jungle gym, she sat on a nearby bench, scrolling through her phone. She researched charities, community organizations, and even local music programs, looking for anything that might offer a lifeline to Ryan. Then an idea struck her: a fundraiser. Claire worked in event planning and had organized dozens of charity galas and community events over the years. She knew the logistics, the contacts, and most importantly, the power of a compelling story. And Ryan's story was one that could move even the coldest heart. The next morning, Claire called her best friend and former colleague, Lisa. "You want to organize a fundraiser?" Lisa asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "Yes," Claire said firmly. "I met this boy, Ryan, and Lisa, he's incredible. He's got the voice of an angel, and he's been singing on the streets to support his grandmother. They're living in a shelter, and they need help." Lisa was silent for a moment. "You've always had a soft spot for a cause," she said finally. "But are you sure this is the right way to go about it? Fundraisers can take weeks to organize, and they don't always bring in the money you hope for." "I know," Claire admitted. "But I have to try. Ryan deserves a chance." "They both do." Lisa sighed, but Claire could hear the faint smile in her voice. "All right. I'm in. What's the plan?" The two women spent the next hour brainstorming. By the time Claire hung up, she had a clear vision: a small benefit concert featuring local talent, with Ryan as the star performer. She could already picture it: a warm, inviting space filled with music, people moved by Ryan's voice, and enough donations to make a real difference in his life. But first, she needed to convince Ryan. The next day, Claire waited outside Lincoln Middle School, her car parked discreetly across the street. When Ryan emerged, his backpack slung over one shoulder, she stepped out and called his name. He looked surprised but walked over to her. "Hey, Miss Henderson. What are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk to you about something," Claire said, her tone gentle. "Do you have a few minutes?" Ryan nodded, curiosity flickering in his eyes. They walked to a nearby bench, and Claire explained her idea. She described the benefit concert, the chance to showcase his talent, and how the money raised could help him and his grandmother. Ryan listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he said, "You want me to sing? In front of a bunch of people?" "Yes," Claire said. "You have an incredible gift, Ryan. And I think people would want to help once they hear your story." He hesitated, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. What if they don't like me? What if I mess up? You won't, Claire said firmly. And even if you get nervous, I'll be there to help you. We'll do this together. Ryan looked at her, his dark eyes filled with uncertainty. Grandma always says we shouldn't rely on other people. She says it's better to figure things out on our own. Claire's heart ached at his words. There's nothing wrong with accepting help when you need it, she said softly. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you brave. Ryan was quiet for a long moment, then he nodded slowly. Okay. I'll do it. Claire smiled, relief flooding through her. Thank you, Ryan. You're going to do amazing. As they walked back toward the shelter, Claire felt a spark of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but this was a start. And for Ryan, it might just be the beginning of something extraordinary. The days leading up to the benefit concert were a whirlwind. Claire threw herself into the planning with an energy she hadn't felt in years, enlisting Lisa's help to secure a venue, recruit performers, and spread the word. They chose a cozy community theater downtown, a space with warm lighting and excellent acoustics that would perfectly complement Ryan's voice. Meanwhile, Claire made it her mission to help Ryan prepare for his big moment. She visited the shelter every afternoon, coordinating with Tom to find a quiet space where they could rehearse. Ryan's grandmother, a frail but kind-eyed woman named Louise, was hesitant at first. You don't have to go to all this trouble, Louise said one afternoon, her voice weak but resolute. We've gotten by just fine without charity. It's not charity, Claire said gently. It's an opportunity. Ryan has a gift, and people need to hear it. This could change things for both of you. Louise looked at Ryan, who stood silently beside her, his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets. After a long pause, she sighed. All right. If Ryan's okay with it, I won't stand in the way. Ryan nodded, a flicker of determination in his eyes. I want to do it, Grandma. I want to help. With Louise's blessing, the rehearsals began. At first, Ryan was shy, his voice barely above a whisper as he sang in the empty room. But Claire encouraged him gently, praising his talent and reminding him why they were doing this. Slowly, his confidence grew. One afternoon, Claire brought her daughters, Lily and Sophie, to a rehearsal. At 8 and 10 years old, they were awestruck by Ryan's voice. He's really good, Mom, Sophie whispered as Ryan sang. I know, Claire said, her heart swelling with pride. By the time the concert day arrived, word had spread throughout the community. Local businesses donated refreshments, musicians volunteered to perform, and neighbors chipped in to cover the theater's rental fee. Claire was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but she knew the real test would be Ryan's performance. That evening, the theater buzzed with excitement as people filed into their seats. Claire stood backstage with Ryan, who paced nervously, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. What if I mess up? He asked, his voice trembling. You won't, Claire said firmly. She crouched down to his level, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Just remember why you're here. Sing for your grandma, and sing for yourself. You've got this, Ryan. He nodded, taking a deep breath. When it was time for his performance, Claire led him to the stage. The lights were bright, and the audience's applause filled the room as Ryan stepped up to the microphone. For a moment, he stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear. Then he looked down at the front row, where Louise sat in her wheelchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She smiled at him, and something in her gaze gave him the courage he needed. Ryan took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to sing. The first note was soft, tentative, but as the melody flowed, his voice grew stronger, filling the theater with its raw, heartfelt beauty. The audience fell silent, captivated by the emotion in every word. It was a song about hope, resilience, and love, one that seemed to echo Ryan's own journey. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Ryan opened his eyes, his face a mixture of shock and relief. Claire stepped onto the stage and gave him a hug, whispering, "You were amazing." Backstage, Ryan found Louise waiting for him. She reached up to take his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice breaking. Ryan smiled, his own eyes misty. "Thanks, Grandma." The evening ended with a standing ovation and a flood of donations. By the time the theater emptied, Claire and Lisa tallied the contributions, their hearts soaring at the total. It was enough to cover Louise's medical bills for months and provide a safety net for both of them. As they packed up, Ryan approached Claire, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you," he said. "For everything." Claire smiled, pulling him into a gentle hug. "You did this, Ryan. Never forget how incredible you are." For the first time, Ryan allowed himself to believe it. The weeks following the concert were filled with cautious optimism. The donations had brought a sense of security for Ryan and Louise they hadn't felt in months. With Claire's help, they moved into a small, clean apartment near Ryan's school. Louise was able to rest properly, and for the first time, Ryan could focus on being a kid again. But the sense of normalcy was short-lived. One afternoon, Claire arrived at the apartment to find Ryan sitting on the couch, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. His usual energy seemed drained, and he looked up at her with tired eyes. "You okay, Ryan?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. "Just tired," he said quietly. "I get tired a lot lately." Claire frowned. "Is it school? Are you not sleeping well?" Ryan shook his head but didn't elaborate. Over the next few days, Claire noticed more signs that something wasn't right. Ryan struggled to keep up with his friends at school, often sitting out during recess. He coughed frequently and complained of chest pain. Claire couldn't ignore it any longer. She spoke to Louise, who admitted she had also noticed Ryan's symptoms but hadn't wanted to worry anyone. "I thought it was just the stress," Louise said, her voice heavy with guilt. "He's been through so much." "But it's been getting worse, hasn't it?" "It has," Claire said gently. "We need to get him checked out." Claire made an appointment at a community health clinic, explaining the urgency to the staff. The day of the appointment, she drove Ryan and Louise to the clinic, trying to mask her own anxiety with a reassuring smile. The doctor, a kind woman with a calm demeanor, ran a series of tests. Ryan was quiet throughout the process, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. When the results came back, the doctor's face was grave. She sat across from Claire, Ryan, and Louise, folding her hands on the desk. "Ryan has a congenital heart defect," she said. "It's a condition that's likely gone undetected because of limited medical care. His heart is working harder than it should, which is causing the fatigue, chest pain, and shortness of breath." Louise gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, God. Is it serious?" The doctor nodded. "It's serious, but it's treatable. He'll need surgery to correct the defect, and the sooner, the better. Without it, his condition will worsen." Claire felt the weight of the words settle over her like a heavy blanket. She glanced at Ryan, who sat stiffly, his expression unreadable. "How soon can we get it done?" she asked. "The surgery is expensive," the doctor said gently. "There are programs that can help, but it will still be a significant cost." Louise's eyes filled with tears. "We don't have that kind of money. We barely have anything." Claire reached over and placed a reassuring hand on Louise's arm. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly. "We're not giving up." Ryan finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Do I have to stop singing?" The doctor smiled kindly. "Not forever. After the surgery and some recovery time, you should be able to sing again, stronger than ever." Ryan nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. As they left the clinic, Claire's mind raced with possibilities. She had seen how the community had rallied around Ryan before, and she was determined to make it happen again. But this time, the stakes were higher, and failure wasn't an option. Louise wiped her tears as they walked to the car. "I don't know how we're going to do this," she murmured. "We will," Claire said, her voice steady. Ryan's going to get that surgery. I promise. Ryan sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window. Claire caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, his expression thoughtful but calm. She knew he was scared, so was she, but they had faced impossible odds before, and they would do it again. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about giving Ryan the chance to live the life he deserved. The urgency of Ryan's condition gave Claire no time to waste. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, drafting emails, creating social media posts, and contacting everyone she could think of. Her phone buzzed constantly with replies, some from friends offering support, others from strangers who had attended the benefit concert and been moved by Ryan's story. By the next morning, her fundraiser had a name, a voice for Ryan. Claire reached out to local businesses, asking for donations and sponsorships. She coordinated with the community theater again, booking it for a second event. This time, the focus was clear, raising enough money for Ryan's surgery. Word spread quickly. Claire's daughters handed out flyers at school, and their teachers helped distribute them to parents. Lisa rallied her own network, pulling in musicians and volunteers. The shelter where Ryan and Louise had once stayed pitched in, sharing the fundraiser details with their supporters. Still, it wasn't enough. One evening, after a long day of planning, Claire sat with David in their living room. "I don't know if we can pull this off," she admitted, her voice trembling. "The surgery is so expensive, and we're nowhere near the goal." David put a comforting arm around her shoulders. "You've done so much already, Claire. You're giving Ryan a fighting chance. But maybe it's time to go bigger." "Bigger how?" David hesitated, then said, "The local news. They love human interest stories, and Ryan's story is incredible. If they pick it up, it could reach thousands of people." Claire's initial instinct was to resist. She didn't want to exploit Ryan or turn his pain into a spectacle. But as she thought about it, she realized David was right. The more people who heard about Ryan, the better his chances. The next day, Claire contacted a reporter she had worked with on a past event. Within hours, the reporter responded, eager to meet Ryan and hear his story. When the piece aired, everything changed. The news segment featured Ryan singing at the concert, his voice raw with emotion, followed by interviews with Claire and Louise. Donations began pouring in, not just from the local community but from people across the state. A well-known musician saw the broadcast and shared Ryan's story on social media, amplifying the fundraiser even further. The second benefit concert was packed, with standing room only. Ryan performed again, his voice even more powerful despite his condition. By the end of the night, the donations surpassed their goal. The next morning, Claire received the call she had been waiting for. The hospital had approved Ryan's surgery, scheduled for the following week. When Claire told Ryan and Louise the news, they both broke down in tears. "I don't know how to thank you," Louise said, her voice choked with emotion. "You don't have to," Claire said, hugging her. "Just focus on Ryan. He's the one who brought us all together." The surgery day arrived with a mixture of hope and fear. Claire, Louise, and a small group of supporters waited anxiously at the hospital, their hearts in their throats. The hours felt like an eternity, but finally, the surgeon emerged with a tired smile. "The surgery was a success," he said. "Ryan's going to be okay." Relief washed over the room like a wave. Claire hugged Louise tightly, both women crying tears of joy. Ryan's recovery was slow but steady. Each day, he grew stronger, his energy returning bit by bit. When he was finally well enough to leave the hospital, a crowd of supporters was waiting to greet him, cheering and clapping as he walked out. Months later, Ryan stood on stage at another community concert, this time as the headliner. His voice rang out, clear and strong, as he sang the song that had started it all. The audience rose to their feet, applauding and cheering for the boy who had inspired an entire community. Backstage, Ryan found Claire waiting for him. He hugged her tightly, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved my life." "No," Claire said, smiling through her tears. You saved ours. As Ryan took the stage for an encore, Claire stood in the wings, her heart full. This was more than a happy ending, it was the beginning of a new chapter, for all of them.